G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. In space there is no interface. Isn't that a lovely little couplet? In space there is no interface. Now when I say interface, I mean the demarcation between a liquid and a gas. Like the surface of a river or a lake or an ocean, where there is a flat plane surface, and underneath you've got the water and above it you've got the air. A similar kind of an interface could be the air and the ground, or the air and the ice, air and the snow. An interface. I say there is no interface in space because there isn't. In space there's a vacuum with many things moving in many directions. But there is no interface. And because there is no interface in space, then I find it impossible to understand how anybody can entertain the notion of building and using an interface vehicle in orbit. Now, a little bit of a crash recovery course. An interface vehicle balances the interplay of forces in two different mediums. The interplay between the aerodynamic force on the sail and the hydrodynamic force on the centreboard, or old style, the hydrodynamic force on the side surface keel area of the ship. And, to a certain degree, the operation of an interface vehicle is child's play. You can teach a 5-year-old how the keel stops the boat from being blown sideways when the sails are set up at an angle. The boat will actually sail into the direction of the wind. Not directly, but with this rig, 45 degrees. When it's sailing across the wind, it's fastest, and the rudder at the back is used to keep the keel pointing in the direction you want to go. Not difficult at all. Child's play, literally. Interface vehicles. In the old days, we used to believe it was the low pressure zone above the sail, so to speak, which created lift in that direction and lift in that direction, or more properly, this way. And the centreboard resisted such a sideways force, and therefore the boat moved forward. However, in the last 20-30 years, people have got a better understanding of aerodynamics, and these days we would say that the mass of the air being deflected to the boat's rear generates a forward thrust component. Yes, it generates a movement to leeward, and that's what is resisted by the centreboard. Okay? It's so simple that sailing clubs have races for 8-year-olds in real boats, on real water, with real sails. As a kid, I had a rowboat. Just as I started to become a teenager, I discovered that if I stood up at the back of the rowboat, I could sail down river. I could sail against the tide in a tidal estuary. By sticking an oar out over the back of the rowboat, I found that I could go maybe 5 or 10 degrees either side of the direction the wind was going, because the boat had no keel area. It had something of a keel, what you'd call a skeg, but it wasn't enough to be able to chortle off across the wind. Child's play, sailing, all right. Now, There are not only sail boats, right? There are also land yachts, and land yachts don't have a centreboard, do they? They don't go ploughing furrows in the dirt when they go screaming up the beach at 4 times the speed of the wind. No, they have wheels, and the wheels provide the same function on land as a centreboard does in the water. It prevents the device from being blown downwind, and it focuses the resultant vector of the thrust caused by displacing the wind from the direction it was going to go, so that the vehicle goes in the desired forward direction. And because wheels are better at it than centreboards, land yachts can sail closer to the wind's actual direction. There are also ice yachts. I don't know if anybody's ever built a snow yacht. That could be fun. And I'm pretty sure nobody has ever tried to operate on the interface between the bottom of a riverbed. Whoopsie, wind's starting to blow my notes away. The bottom of a riverbed and the tide of the river. But technically it's theoretically possible. These are all interface vehicles. They use the ebb and flow of the currents in the medium against the resistance of another medium in order to go where you want to go. So, yeah, interface vehicles are a perfectly fine form of technology. They've been around for thousands of years. In fact, I heard some archaeologists on the radio fairly recently discussing how it was almost certain that human beings had been sailing for thousands of years before they ever tried to ride on a horse. So, now let's get on to the entry point. In space there is no interface, okay? So, there'd been a lot of arguments about how to propel yourself in space. Back in the early days of ballistic missile technology, there were people who reckoned that rockets wouldn't work in space because the engine would have nothing to push against. They were obviously wrong. A rocket engine works by throwing shit away. You can stand in a rowboat and throw 40-pounder rocks off the stern and find that the rowboat is moving at a brisk walking pace in the direction opposite that which was taken by the rocks. Action, reaction. However, not long after satellites became a reality, creating a debris cloud around the Earth, people came up with the idea that they could go sailing on the photon pressure of the wind coming out of the sun, the solar wind. And the first time I read it, I knew it was a strange idea, and as I got to play with sailing boats, I have sailed 4 boats, owned 3 of them, as a teenager and a young man. I realised that there was big problems with this idea of sailing in orbit using solar pressure on space sails. And NASA has actually flown experiments on 3 missions testing solar sails, and every time they go wrong. Put a little bit of time in the past couple of days because I got inspired by seeing the International Space Station go over while I was waiting for the moon to rise above the trees so that I could film a clip with an outside fire. And the International Space Station was so clear and visible. It was a still night, very cool, and it was so visible that with the naked eye I could see 2 reflections from the solar panels on either side of a hull. And it got me thinking about space technology and what works and what doesn't work. It's not always that shiny, but if you get that period in time when the sun's down and the moon has not yet risen above your shadow horizon, satellites are being bottom lit from both sides, and they're particularly easy to see. And the International Space Station went almost directly overhead, shining brighter than Venus. So anyway, here's why solar sails are a fool of an idea. Whereas an actual sailboat balances the aerodynamic pressure of the sails against the hydrodynamic pressure of the keel and is steered by the hydrodynamic pressure of the rudder, a solar sail would be pulling on what in hydrodynamic terms would be a boat that has no difference in sideways profile no matter which side you look at it from. So if you were to build a boat shaped like this satellite dish and then attach a circular parachute to a post on the boat, on the dish-shaped boat, it wouldn't matter how you pulled on the strings, the parachute would always go where the wind wanted to blow it. And if you try and shorten the strings on one side of the parachute, with a game plan of going from sailing downwind to tacking across the wind, well, I think you're going to have some problems. Part one, you're going to have less frontal surface area for the photons to impact with. So, in the solar wind, you're going to make less thrust. However, if you consider that you're going to be deflecting the photons off to one side, and you've got no keel and you've got no rudder, so you've got no control over the orientation of the capsule. So, unlike the maritime case, where you're going to be able to balance aerodynamic and hydrodynamic forces to be able to sail within at least 25 and sometimes 40 degrees of where the wind's coming from, as soon as you try and shorten one side of the shroud lines and lengthen the other side of the shroud lines, you go from the case in black where photons entering hit the slightly curved surface of the sail, bounce across to the other side and exit on the same path. Therefore the photon pressure keeps the parachute-shaped sail inflated, and all of the photons change in direction is converted into thrust. If you bring one leading edge up close and let the other leading edge trail, you get a different photon path. It comes in, it runs at a shallow angle, it crosses and bounces out at a shallow angle. So yeah, you get thrust, a reduced thrust, away from the source of the solar wind, but because you've got no keel and no rudder to keep the keel pointing where you want it to go, you've got no way of maintaining the orientation of the entire device. And because that's where your anchors are attached, and this is where your centre of effort is, the resultant vector is going to rotate it to the point where the leading edge gets in front of the solar wind, and then the whole lot collapses and wraps up in a ball or a mess. And here's the other point. Unless you've got masts and spars to try and maintain the circumference of the sail, then tension from the strings is going to give you a situation where every time the capsule is going to be at the optical focus. So you're going to wind up with several football field sized mirror, like maybe acres square, catching huge amounts of sunlight and focusing it back on the capsule with the crew in it. So my way of understanding it, unless you're going to have masts and spars in the sky, you're not going to be able to hold the sail in shape. And because you've got no keel and no rudder, you're not going to be able to orient the sail that you can't hold in shape towards the direction of the solar wind. And then because you've got no keel, you've got no side area, so you can't tack either. And this is the hillbilly hermit fool on the hills suggestion for why every time NASA tries to fly a solar sail, it wraps itself up in $1 million ball in the sky. But there's no laws against wasting money in space. There's no shortage of people who are sick of planet Earth and want to go somewhere else to live. The trouble is, gravity makes it too expensive. Ciao!